All right, well, I'm very glad to have everybody join us today. Some of you are here in person and others of you will watch this at a later time. I'm Professor Diascro. I'm a political scientist by training, but I'm on the staff of UCDC, and I teach in the program regularly. The general research seminar is the class I teach most often, but I also teach a judicial process class and a law and society class. And I also do work on the curriculum. Sabrine Saeed and I work together in the academic services program. So I'm happy to lead this session in the UCDC professional development series that we're offering every Wednesday. This is a great series. And at the end of this session, we'll announce some of our future contributors to this series as well as we go through the term. So the focus today is on some basics of academic writing that I think will help you in your classes. If you're a current UCDC student, you can throw into the chat which seminar you're taking. That would be great. I'll come back to that in a few minutes. But a lot of what I'll cover today is not just relevant to your classes, but to writing that you would do for your internships, depending upon where you're working, and for other professional writing as well. So in other classes that you're taking in school, but also in a work environment too. So I'm gonna use my slides, which I'm already sharing with you. And when we're done, I will share those actually. We'll download the slide deck and make them available to you. I have a few hidden slides that have some examples of some of the things that I'll be talking about today, but I didn't want to get too much into the weeds today as I keep my eye on the time. And so when you get the slide deck, if you want to take a look at it, you'll see those slides there with some examples of things that I'll be talking about. We can also do a Q&A at the end if there's any questions that you have, but if you want to interrupt me, feel free to do that as well. Okay, so let's start with this slide. This is me writing all the time, writing. I love writing, but this is still me in the writing process. Okay. Someone asked me where the paws are on this cat, and I have no idea where they are, but there it is. Okay. So I always like to start off when I'm talking about writing by reminding everybody and anybody who's paying attention that writing is just extremely hard. If you are challenged in your writing process, then you are in extremely good company, all right? Most of us are not born writers. It sometimes seems like that. And of course, there are some people who are kind of more naturally talented at writing than others. And that's the case with lots of things. But most of writing requires a lot of learned skills. And we learn differently, we learn at different paces, we learn in different environments, we come with different learned skills from different cultures. And so that all plays into how easily or how much difficulty we have with writing. And it's always just good to remember that reading proficiency affects your writing. Reading is such a big part of writing. Grammar and composition are major parts of writing, and we learn those. We're not born knowing proper grammar and composition. It takes a lot of organization and discipline to write well and clearly. We have to synthesize ideas, and the process of synthesis can be a huge challenge. Critical thinking is about the work of others and your own work, and to be a good, strong critical thinker just takes enormous amounts of practice. This is not a linear process either. So many of my students think that, you start at point A and then you get to point B, and there's kind of this upward progression in the writing process. And there isn't. It mostly looks like this. Yes, that is a drawing that I made all on my own. It has a starting point, which is nice. And it does have an ending point, which I usually get to at some point. But in here, there is a lot of making left and right turns and going backwards and looping around before I get to the end. And I just think it's really good to remember that it is a chaotic process, that you're taking a lot of time, it takes a lot of patience, and it takes endless practice to get to a point where you feel comfortable writing. This is really just a lifelong struggle in some cases, certainly a lifetime challenge, and a lifetime effort to do this well. Despite what it may seem like, and I'm sure it often seems like this, most of your colleagues in your classes are also struggling with their writing processes. And I think it's easy to be defeated in writing when you think that it comes easily to others. And like I said at the beginning, sometimes it does for some, but most of your classmates are struggling just like you, and they need help in a lot of different areas. And the important thing is to know where you're struggling and to get the assistance that you need so you can continue improving, because writing is just going to be a fundamental part of what you do in school, as you already know, but certainly beyond school as well. Okay. So there's a number of common issues, and this list kind of makes up the agenda for today. I'll go through each of these topics in more or less detail, but lots and lots of people have difficulty with grammar, just the basics of grammar, punctuation, and spelling. I'm a horrible speller, so we'll talk a little bit about resources that we can use to help us with that. Composition, the structure of sentences and the structure of paragraphs, is also a primary source of difficulty for lots of college students and even practiced writers. Synthesizing information, like I mentioned, and often in academic writing, this comes in the form of literature reviews, which some of you may be familiar with. This is also a challenge, and I'll talk about why that is. Evidence and argument development are also critically important, and we'll end today with at least a nod to citation and plagiarism, which are extremely important, and I could spend probably a semester talking about, but we'll get to just kind of the basics there at the very end of today. Okay, so let's start with just a list of some of the writing assignments. This is kind of a busy slide, and you can take a look at this later, but I wanted to, for our current students, these are the basic writing assignments that the different classes, the different seminars are requiring this term. And you can see there's some variation in them. A lot of them are based on self-selected topics, which is a challenge in and of its own, coming up with ideas that you want to write about and figuring out where to start and where to end. That loopy-de-loop picture that I drew is especially chaotic when you're doing a self-selected topic. A couple of our professors have more prompted assignments like the Supreme Court and the Congress class. And so I included some of the questions that they ask on their very first assignments as just a reminder to you. Those are due, I think, in a couple weeks. But I may come back to those if I have some time to provide some examples. But it gives you just an idea of the range of things that you all are doing for your writing assignments. Just as a reminder, and this might be useful for our students who are here or who will be tuning in, who are would-be UCDC students, our seminars require usually 20 cumulative pages of analytic writing. And so for classes like mine, which is a general research seminar, students write in bits and pieces, but then they put together a whole 20-page paper. In other classes, like the media class, for example, there's a number of short news stories or memo type writing, and then there's a longer project as well. But for all of the classes, there's at least 20 pages of expository writing. Okay, so briefly on grammar and punctuation and spelling. Like I said, I'm very bad at spelling. I've become very good at taking advantage of electronic and online resources. And there was a time, not to age me too quickly here, but where we didn't have things like online resources or electronic resources. And once these became kind of, popular, and you didn't have to pick up a dictionary or ask the nearest adult near you how you spelled something or where you put a comma, these are really useful tools, and I'm constantly surprised at how infrequently my students use them, actually. So just as a reminder, in Word and also in Google Docs, I don't have it indicated here, but in Word, you can set your settings so that it will check spelling and grammar for you. Okay, there is nothing wrong, at least in my classes. You might want to ask instructors in other classes if they mind you doing this. I've never heard of an instructor who minded any student spell checking and grammar checking their work. All right, it makes it much easier for everybody to read your work when things are in good shape. There are some apps that can help you with grammar. My students have mixed reviews about Grammarly, but several of them have liked Grammar Check in the past. There is an online writing lab at Purdue University that I think is one of the very best online writing labs in the country. I highly recommend it for all kinds of things. I'll come back to it later with citation and plagiarism. But they have a great website. And so I've included the link here where they do, where they talk about some grammar rules and things like that. And then, you know, you guys are the kings and queens, as it were, of YouTube. I'm relatively new to YouTube, but evidently they have lots of tutorials on all kinds of things. And so you should take advantage of this. Not every source is like the most reputable source, but usually you can tell if the university has put together a tutorial or something that might be really helpful. And for especially students who are, for whom English is a second language, these can be extremely helpful. But I have used some of them as well. Grammar is not an easy thing, and you should not at all be concerned with using some of these helpful tools.
Can I ask a question?
Yes, please, Sabrine.
Okay, so I appreciate this conversation. As someone who has read a lot of papers and read them over the years, what are some of maybe the like top 3 grammar mistakes that you see students making or just not incorporating into their writing that you wish that they took advantage or considered more?
So it's a great question. And actually my next slide,
Perfect.
Well, no, I won't go to it. Hit it. It's in the deck, so you can take a look at it. But really quickly, since I have it in my notes, I can tell you. So one of the biggest issues that I find are verb tenses. So, and verb tenses are really a challenge, especially for students for whom English is a second language, but even for English first language speakers, it is really a challenge. And so, and it doesn't come naturally, and sometimes you're writing very complex sentences and it's hard to tell what the subject is and therefore then what the verb is. And so one of the ways that we deal with this, I'll come back to this a little bit with composition, is that you can simplify sentences so that it clarifies what the actual noun is, and so then you can have an appropriate verb and verb tense that goes with it. But I'm correcting verb tenses constantly. Is versus are and those kinds of things can be a real challenge. Possessives are another grammar problem about how we use possessives. And, you know, sometimes we're missing verbs, sometimes we're missing subjects. And sometimes that's a punctuation issue, sometimes that's a grammar issue, sometimes it's a run-on sentence issue. So I've got some examples of those in the next slide, and like it won't come up right now, but it'll show up in the slide deck. That's a great question. So before I move on, proofreading your work. Now, one might ask, if I do not know my grammar, my punctuation, and my spelling particularly well, how am I supposed to proofread my work? And it's a great question. So what I tell students to do are at least 2 things. One is if you can get another set of eyes on your work, that's helpful. Especially somebody who maybe has a command of the language a little bit better than you, or is somehow just more experienced in some ways, that would be really helpful. And it helps you pick up typos and stuff too. Your brain is this amazing organ that oftentimes sees what it expects to see and not necessarily what's there. And I make all kinds of typo mistakes without really actually seeing it. I mean, I think seriously, my brain just does not trigger my eye to see it, but somebody else picks it up really easily. So I always have somebody else read my work. That can be hard because we don't always like people to read our work, especially if they're going to be critical or ask us questions about it that we're not prepared to answer. But if you have somebody who loves you, especially, and they'll treat you nicely, then that's a good habit. But reading out loud to yourself is huge. Even if you don't have terrific command of writing, putting the words on paper, we are much better, most of us, at hearing what we're saying and thinking about what we're saying. Writing it down, getting it out of your head and onto paper is just an extra huge challenge for almost all of us. So when you can hear it, usually you'll stumble over a sentence that doesn't sound right. And if you don't know the answer to like why it doesn't sound right, at least it's a trigger to you that you might need some help trying to figure out how to say it better than you are. Okay, so proofreading in a variety of different ways can really, really be helpful. I talk out loud in my office all the time when I'm writing. This is a big deal for me, and usually it's designed well, in part to keep me company, but the other part is to catch mistakes that I'm making. This is just, it's really, really important. Okay, so related to grammar, punctuation, and spelling is composition. And lots of students, unless you're an English major, most of us don't really think about what composition is, but it's very much the structure of how you put words together. Okay, so we often think of sentence structure as composition, but then also how you put sentences together. And of course, this all leads to then how you construct paragraphs and how paragraphs go together to construct a larger essay and what the substance of that essay is insofar as developing an argument. So this all kind of builds together, and we'll get to the argument part in a few minutes, but there's some pretty common composition errors that you will recognize. And a couple of them I already mentioned when Sabrina asked her question, but incomplete sentences where you're missing a subject, a verb, or an object. And you might ask, well, what's a verb and what's an object? So those are kind of grammar issues that we could talk about at another time if we had more time. But when you're reading a sentence, usually this is a problem with run-on sentences, like you have put in a period where it doesn't belong, or you've left out a period where it does belong, or you're not using semicolons properly or commas. There's clauses and things that get kind of mixed up. And oftentimes this happens with my students when I think they're trying to be fancy. And I'm like, don't write fancy, just say what you mean. And of course, for me to say what you mean is hard enough. I understand that, but you really just want to make things simple. You're trying to communicate something to somebody else. Say it as simply as you possibly can. Okay, so we have issues with kind of the periods and the clauses and things. And then paragraph breaks. I cannot tell you how many papers I get where it takes like 3 pages to get to the first paragraph break. You need to pause at the very least in your writing. And very often you're switching subjects or you're taking a turn, and paragraph breaks are ways of indicating that to your reader. It really does help the flow of what you're saying happen more freely and more clearly. And so you really do want to include paragraph breaks. I'm constantly putting in the little paragraph sign in my notations and papers. Okay, so those are just a few of those. And if we were doing a bigger workshop, we would go into examples. I do have a hidden slide. And in fact, I think I have 2 or 3. Yes, I have 3 slides that come after this. They're hidden, but they're in the slide deck, where I've pulled excerpts from papers that I've had in the past, completely anonymous from years ago. But they give you an idea of like what my edits look like on certain passages of paper. So you can get a sense of what it would look like if I marked up your paper and where the mistakes are, especially with run-on sentences and incomplete sentences. Okay, so moving along then. A thesis. This is now in, we're past kind of composition and grammar, maybe the lower levels or kind of in the weeds of writing in terms of issues that students have. A thesis is, for those of you who don't know, the primary idea or proposition that you're making in your essay, whatever you are writing. And all assignments, whether they are, I shouldn't say all because I don't want to be that specific, but I can't think of an assignment that I have ever given in 30 years of teaching that didn't require, indirectly or directly, a thesis statement of some kind, okay? And the reason for that is that having a primary idea that you can communicate, a proposition that you're making about something, whatever the topic is just, as I say here on the slide, it's just integral to keeping you focused and on point. And that's really important for you so that you don't end up wandering off in a million different directions. But again, the purpose, at least one purpose of writing, is to communicate to other people what is on your mind. And if you can't stay focused and be able to explain what's on your mind to somebody else, you're going to lose them. And that's not the object of writing, is to lose your readers. You want to keep them engaged. So knowing what your primary idea or your proposition is extremely important. Okay. Oftentimes your thesis comes from a question, either a question that you ask or a problem that you identify. And thinking back onto the list of assignments that are part of the seminars for this term, in my class, in Danielson's class in world politics and international development, and a whole slew of others, including, Sandelo's class on the media, you will be asked to come up with your own problem or your own question, right? And from that question or from that problem will come then a central proposition that you make in your assignment. And then if sometimes you have professors or instructors who will give you, sorry, that's my phone, if you will give you the prompts that you need. So they'll provide you with the question or the problem. And if you remember, I highlighted the Supreme Court prompt, or I highlighted the Congress prompt that Professor Lawrence gives. Even in those situations where you get the question or you get the problem, you are, you will have to then develop the proposition. You will have to develop the thesis from that. Okay. So part of what makes thesis development hard is that it requires that you know what you want to say. And this is a challenge. And I think my third bullet, my third sub-bullet point there is really, really important. It requires that you read a little bit about your topic and get a sense of what you're thinking about. And then you have to think about it. I mean, that sounds kind of obvious, but often we're just in a rush, right? It's like getting from A to B to C, and we're just not, we don't spend as much time thinking as we need to about what we write. And writing just really requires lots of thinking, and that requires lots of time. Okay, so reading and thinking, and then reading and thinking some more. Okay, so that's kind of the process. Your assignment prompt will help you, but you really want to reflect on what you're interested in, what's meaningful to you, and how you can really kind of zoom in a little bit, sometimes off of a very broad topic, zooming into something that is really relevant or compelling to you as you develop a primary point. You want to think about being as succinct as you can. Okay, again, this is a communication skill, and I have an example that I'll show you where I took something that is not particularly succinct and I made it pretty succinct, and so you'll get a sense of that on the next slide in just a minute. So again, the idea here is that you're linking together. This will help you link together your ideas. It will help you stay focused when you're doing research. This is really just a critical, it's like the spine, if you will, of your paper, whatever size paper it is and whatever kind of paper it is. It anchors your ideas. Okay. One confusing part of a thesis is that we use that concept when we're talking about like a whole paper or a project, like a dissertation thesis if you're in graduate school, or an honors thesis, which is a pretty big paper in college. But we also talk about a thesis for a chapter of a book, or we talk about a thesis for a paragraph too, like a thesis statement. Or a sentence, a lead-off statement. So I don't want students to be too confused. Usually we're talking about a thesis in this context as the primary idea in whatever size opus you happen to be writing, whether it's 2 pages or 5 pages or 20 pages for my class. Okay. All right. All right. So let me give you some examples just real quickly from my classes. These are somewhat old examples, but so this is one. I should probably have quotation marks around it. So a student wrote, "This paper will examine the current legal status of enhanced interrogation techniques in regards to the rule of law and what addendums need to be made in order for the United States to realign interrogation techniques to uphold the current legal codes." Okay, so that's like a really long sentence. There's a lot of stuff in there. And so one other way to say that is this. This paper will examine the legality of enhanced interrogation techniques. Okay, short, succinct, it gets to all of these points. You've got the rest of the paper to elaborate on all of this. Your thesis is to the point, okay? This helps you stay focused, and it helps lead in a reader really well. Okay, so someone else asked a question. Does placing juvenile offenders in solitary confinement result in psychological harm? It's a terrific question. The thesis then might be your position on this, right? Where you come down on this, what you think the answer is. Then you'll develop the answer afterwards. Juvenile offenders experience psychological harm from solitary confinement. A different thesis could be that they don't, right? But this one is, so you're making an affirmative, not necessarily a yes, but an affirmative kind of aggressive statement about what you think the answer is. Another example, what effects will the construction of a wall along the United States southern border have on the environment? Great question. The construction of a wall on the southern border will have negative effects on the environment. Okay, then your paper would be about this wall on the southern border and how it would create negative effects and what those negative effects would be. All right, so those are just a couple of examples there to give you an idea of how you can take questions and create thesis statements, and also how you can have a thesis statement that's really kind of unwieldy and you can focus it a lot more carefully and clearly. Okay, so on to synthesizing. I mentioned this at the beginning. I think this is one of the hardest parts for my students when they're doing research, but it is an integral part, certainly of social science research, but also historical research, legal research. I mean, it really is really important. It comes in a variety of different packages. There's lots of different disciplines do synthesis in different ways. In social science and in the sciences more generally, usually we're talking about literature reviews, so I'll come back to that in just a second. But a synthesis of information is pretty much when you ask yourself kind of, what do we know, or what do I know about this topic? And when you synthesize, what you're doing is you're taking pieces of what we know and you're putting them together, okay? And in a literature review, which is a very particular kind of synthesis, we're examining the research that's been done in the past, and we're providing, it helps lead our own research, but it also helps provide context for our research. Okay. Are there questions in the chat? I can see it coming up a little bit, but I'm happy to put them off if they're, okay. All right. So, so one of the important things is to know that new research builds on previous research. We'll come back to this when we talk about plagiarism, which is really important. It is a rare day when we are coming up with completely new ideas and completely new responses to things. Usually this is knowledge is incremental and we're building on the work that other people have done. And the process of synthesis is something that takes some time, which is, I think, one of the reasons why a lot of students struggle with it, because they don't feel like they have the time or they don't allocate the time for it. But really what you're doing is you're creating your own puzzle from the pieces of others. So what you do is you read related research. These could be articles, reports, policy briefs. They could be confirmation hearings or congressional hearings of other kinds, or whatever they are, based on your thesis, all right, your primary point. So you use your thesis to guide you. And then you deconstruct those articles, reports, looking for the pieces, parts that are relevant to what your question is and what your thesis is. And then you reconstruct those pieces into what will be your argument, or what will be the primary claims that you make in your piece. And so it is very much, I always think of this as, research is this process of taking one puzzle, which is somebody else's research, pulling the pieces apart, and then refitting them into your own space. All right. And so what we're doing when we're doing research and we're synthesizing is we're developing our own puzzles. We're putting the pieces together in our own unique way. That's how we make original contributions to the knowledge. It's not always that we have original puzzle pieces. It's that the way we put them together is unique. All right, that becomes ours, and it becomes our contribution to the research. Okay, and doing this then provides foundation, it provides background, and oftentimes we're using the previous research as evidence for our research, right? We're building on it, and it provides information that we can use for our own research. So that takes me to then the next slide, which is about evidence. And I'm going to go through this one a little bit quickly because I have my eye on the clock. But evidence is just absolutely critical to any analytical writing that you do, all right? Otherwise, you are just expressing a belief or an opinion about something. But if you want to make an analytic argument about something, you need to bring support. And that support comes in the form of lots of different kinds of information. So on this slide, and that information comes in its different kinds, and you can combine it in different ways. There's a lot of creativity in the way we put together, the way we identify evidence, and then also how we put it together to make our puzzle. So I'm just going to throw up these categories here. There's a lot of different ways to think about how to categorize evidence. This is just one way of doing it, but this is usually the way my students in my class think about evidence. But and it gets to like kind of broad categories within these. But like I said, there's a lot of different ways to do this. But We talk about quantitative evidence, which is numeric usually. It comes in the form of surveys and polls and census data and the like. It's countable, it's measurable. Okay, so that's what quantitative, usually we say quantitative data, but it could be a lot of things. It's not just necessarily data in the way we normally think of that. Qualitative information is extremely important too, and that usually is in the form of, if this is numeric, then we talk about language, right? So this comes in the form of texts, documents, primary and secondary sources, interviews with people, legislative testimony, stories that people tell, all kinds of language text. The Constitution is a text, right? It's qualitative information, not quantitative information. And then we can talk about information that is on a big scale and other information that is on a much narrower scale, and how you use that and how you combine those, tell different kinds of stories and provide different levels of support for your thesis. So it's worth just considering these categories and knowing that there's just lots of different kinds of evidence that you can bring to bear. You always want to talk to your instructor. Sometimes for different prompts, you should use only certain information and not other information, and that's perfectly reasonable in the context of a class. If you're doing research for your internship or for another employer, you might want to ask or get a sense at least of what is appropriate kind of information that they use as evidence for their analyses. And sometimes for class writing, like in the Congress class perhaps and in the Supreme Court class, they might want you to use no outside sources, but only sources of information that come from class. Right? So you just want to make sure that you're using, you're paying attention to the prompts and you're using the information that you should. Okay, two more topics. One is argument. And I have a little bit of a diagram. I have two slides actually on this that are diagrams. The primary idea here is that it's hard to piece then all these pieces together, right? You've done a lot of research, you've done a lot of reading, you have collected evidence, you have tried to connect it to your thesis, and then you need to string kind of all of this together in some kind of logical form so that you can present this set of ideas in order to hopefully convince, or convert somebody to a particular position. I mean, that's why we're often writing argumentative papers. So I have this source that I use, which I just love. It's called The Craft of Research. I think it's out of print, but you can get back editions now by Booth, Collum, and Williams. And I pulled this little part from one of their chapters because it's just so clear in terms of how you can string together in just a basic sentence or in a more elaborate structure. I'll show you on the next slide. This kind of the claim you make. They use different concepts. They don't say thesis, they say claim, and then you include kind of a reason for it, and then you present evidence. So using an example from a slide or so ago about the juvenile offenders and psychological harm, the claim would be there: the juvenile offenders experience psychological harm from solitary confinement because, okay, so this is the claim, this is the thesis, because the absence of human contact short circuits neural connections in the brain that causes depression. Okay, that's the reason. But if you just leave a reason without evidence, then no one has any way of knowing if it's just your assumption about something or if it's actually based on fact or research, scientific study, or something that gives them more reason to be to believe that it's not just a process of your belief system, but that it is something more concrete. Okay, so you say then, or you can say, based on, oops, let me go back, based on, this is based on research by, so-and-so, whoever it is, this is how we do citations, that shows that the brain chemistry related to depression is affected by human contact. And that becomes then the basis of, one component of an argument on this thesis that juvenile offenders experience psychological harm from solitary confinement. You would probably have a number of different reasons with a number of pieces of evidence depending upon how big your project was. And so that Sorry, there's too many things I'm clicking here. Okay, so that's where this next slide comes in. This is also from the same book, but if you were writing a bigger paper, or at least a couple pages, you might have, you know, what you have as your introductory claim, and then you would have a number of different reasons backed up by different pieces of evidence, and then you would conclude your paper. This is oversimplified for sure, but when I'm in that middle of that red circular blob of writing and you have all this information and you're trying to figure out how to put it all together, thinking simply and bringing things to their fundamentals can really, really help you sort through your ideas. So you might have a thesis and you might say, you know, I have 3 reasons for thinking that this is in fact true. And they are 1, 2, and 3. And I have maybe 2 pieces of evidence that support reason 1. You might have 10 pieces of evidence that support reason 2, and 1 piece of evidence that supports reason 3. But all together, those things create this argument for you that leads you to this conclusion, which is really often just a restatement of your introduction. Okay, so at least you get a sense of kind of how this is structured. Most writing projects are much more complicated than this, obviously. But again, coming back to fundamentals when you feel like you're just in this kind of the middle of the chaos of writing can be really, really helpful.
And in this, and just to clarify, in this case, your introductory claim would be
your thesis. Yeah, they use claim instead of thesis, but it's the same idea.
Yes.
Okay. All right, so let's talk just at the end, we're almost done, about citation and plagiarism, last but not least. All right, a few things I want to say about this. First of all, research builds on the idea of others. I mentioned this before, and arguments require evidence, oftentimes collected or known by others, not by you, the person writing. So borrowing from others is absolutely appropriate, and in fact, it is required. It is absolutely necessary for writing. Okay. The problem that we have is that, well, so let me just say that there are different forms of borrowing, and these are just 2, but the most obvious ones are when we take from somebody else's work and we quote them. So we word for word from an original text, or we pull from a website certain data or something like that. And if it's text, we usually put quotation marks around it. If it's data, we just kind of present it. Or we paraphrase, which is always very confusing for students, and it just takes a lot of practice. This is when you're expressing the same idea or meaning that somebody else has had, but you use your own words to do it. So when we talk about paraphrasing, we often say, use your own words, but the idea is that it's somebody else's idea. You're still borrowing, even though you're reframing it a little bit, or you're restating it a little bit, you're repackaging it a bit, okay? But the fundamental idea is not yours, it's somebody else's, okay? And when you're paraphrasing, you don't need quotation marks because it's not word for word from the original source, okay? So the problem comes when you borrow, which is not the problem. Borrowing is absolutely what you need to do, but the problem is borrowing without crediting. And that fundamentally boils down to stealing people's ideas. I mean, it really, this is where the idea of intellectual property comes from. It's not your television set that somebody walked by your dorm room. That's painful even to say now because we don't have, not too many of us have dorm rooms, but the idea is that you walk by somebody's room and the door is open. This is like reading a text, right? And you say, oh, that's so cool, I'm gonna use that. And so you just walk in and take the TV off the wall and off you go. It's like, that's not okay. So if you open a book or you open source material of any kind, and the material there is not yours, in other words, you didn't write it or put it there, that means it's somebody else's, all right? That doesn't mean that you can't use it or borrow it. In fact, it's the height of flattery to use other people's research in your own research. That's what we require that. That's what knowledge is. It's building on the work of other people, but you have to give them credit for doing so. And so this becomes confusing for lots of people. And there's all kinds of very famous examples of plagiarism. We won't talk about them now, but Vice President Biden is known for his loose borrowing of other people's texts, but so are lots of other people, famous and not famous. So my last slide is just some things to think about when you are focusing on citation. Citing is identifying the original source of your ideas and your information. And one thing I don't have on here, but I really should, so I'll have to adapt these slides, is that it's what's really critical here is how you take your notes. When you're reading and you're recording what you're reading, you want to be really careful about what you're reading and where you're getting information. And if somebody says something and you're like, oh my God, that's just brilliant, I have to use that, make sure you put quotation marks around it. Make sure that you indicate the page number that you get it from. Make sure you have all of this information, this bibliographic information, so that you know where you got something. So later you don't use it in your paper and think, oh my gosh, did I say that or did somebody else say that? Because even the mistake of somebody else saying it without you realizing it is still plagiarism. It's plagiarism no matter whether you intend to do it or not. Okay. Most of you will be familiar with some of the common formats. The American Psychological Association is the most common format for the social sciences. The MLA is the most common for humanities. Sometimes your instructors care about what format of citation you use, so you always want to ask. And then these are online resources, and I've already mentioned Purdue OWL. They are phenomenal. The University of North Carolina has a terrific online writing center too that I just think are great. And that's not to say that the UC schools don't have them, but these are the best online ones in terms of really functioning well, even if you're not a student at those universities. Grammarly lets you throw in text and we'll do a search on similarity and to tell you whether it thinks that you have borrowed words or not. And then that will alert you to whether you need to cite properly or whether you've put something in quotation marks properly. And then Turnitin is a software program that we actually use at UCDC. Not all professors do, but some of us do, to help teach you how to recognize and how to learn how not to plagiarize. Okay. So those are most of my slides. I guess I lied. I have one more slide and you can just kind of take a look at this at your own convenience. But I did put together all of the links for the UC campus writing centers. And I want to be really clear that I looked at all of them and they all look like they're open and that they are assisting students in their writing wherever you are. And so even when students are present at UCDC in the center, we try to encourage them to use their writing centers as well. Sometimes you know people who are there and it's just good to reconnect and have them give you some assistance. But especially under remote circumstances, they are there to help everybody everywhere if you are a student on campus. And so I encourage all of you, if you need to use the resources that you have on campus for some additional help that you might need. Again, that proofreading bit can be really helpful if you have somebody else's eyes. And so that might be somebody at a writing center who would not tell you how to write your assignment, but would provide an extra set of eyes for your work. Okay. So I am happy to take any questions that there might be. I'm right at 3:50. So Shay has some announcements to provide at the end of this session, but I'm more than happy to answer a couple questions if they exist.
Dr. Diaskar, I have one question.
Yes, Young Chan.
So it's about the paragraph breaks. That's something that I personally struggle with.
Yeah.
You said that it's either pauses or changes in topics, and changes in topics, it's easy for me to identify, but pauses that I struggle with. So sometimes I'll have really long paragraphs because in my mind, it is the same topic.
Yep.
And I've gotten the same feedback that you've given students where my professors have said, you should have broken this up into paragraphs. And I still don't know how to identify those breaks for pauses in the same topic.
So it depends on what you're writing, but sometimes what we're doing, even if we're not doing it specifically, what we're doing is we're listing, like you're going through like a list. So sometimes when you write, you'll say first, second, third. And if there's 8 things, sometimes after the 4th, you might make a paragraph break and say, in addition, there are 4 additional points, and then you can go on to those. And it just it breaks up the flow a little bit, but not just in a way that helps somebody take a breath. I mean, literally when they're reading, they can take a breath when they do that. Even if you're not numbering things, finding a natural space where you might say to be continued, or, where you might, if you're reading through it, you might naturally have grouped things together where there's a slightly different turn from what you were saying before, or just literally like where you would take a physical breath, then that's a good place. Other times it's like break it in half. I mean, seriously, put it up on the screen and see, oh my gosh, that took a page. I think I'm going to break it, you know, at 3/4, or I'm going to break it at half the page down. Where does it make the most sense? And then you can create a last sentence and then a first sentence to the next paragraph that help make the flow clear, that you haven't switched topics, but that you're continuing, you're just giving somebody the chance to blink or, you know, take that physical breath that they need to. I'd be more than happy to help you when you do some writing, and it, a lot of it's practice and a lot of it comes from reading, right? So look and see where the people who you read, see how they make paragraph breaks. When do they kind of do that? And it's so much of this is just modeling and learning how to do it by mimicking, which is how we learn how to speak too, right? So why shouldn't we do it with our writing as well?
I was just gonna, one last thing was
Sure.
just validating piece of when you said to read your own writing out loud and to read a lot. I just wanted to put it out there that I learned English from scratch when I was 10 because I only knew Korean when I immigrated here. And those two techniques have helped me learn English fluently, like in 2-3 years. Like those two tips are so crucial.
I'm so glad to hear that.
Yeah, I love that you said that today. So thank you.
But it's, I don't want to minimize too, and I always worry about this. There is an extra, you know, like I said, writing is hard. It's hard if you're writing in the language that you know how to write in, right? It is exponentially more difficult to write in a language that is not your first language. English, I think is, I mean, I haven't had to learn Korean, but I just think English is like one of the hardest nonsensical languages ever. And I didn't realize that until I started teaching my kids how to read and write. And then I was like, oh my gosh, sight work. Anyway, so I could go on, but it is very, very difficult. And so, you know, we often get students for whom English is their second language, and to add the burden of, you know, it's hard enough to write in your native language, let alone in English. It gets really, really challenging. I can say that at UCDC, we give as much time and as attention to that as we can so that we help our students really learn how to make those additional steps. But you're right, speaking out loud and having somebody who loves you listen to you and correct you, and having a separate set of eyes on your work and reading is just so critical. Thank you for that.
I got a quick question as somebody who's written a great deal. So I'm curious because it's something I still struggle with, and I agree with everything you've said about it being difficult. So what do you do when you are staring at a blank screen and you just don't know what to do? And you know the topic real well, but you're just basically writer's block. I'm just curious how others get over this.
Hold on, I don't know how, because I'm so lame with my slides. I'm going back to my first one. So I'll get there in a couple minutes. It's the cat with the head banging. Yeah. So I think taking a break is always good. It depends on like why. So this is what I do. But in all seriousness, I think it depends on why you're doing it. I mean, sometimes you're staring, well, you said it, you're staring at a screen, and even though you know a lot, right? Sometimes I go off and I start talking to somebody else about what it is that I want to write on. And usually it's my husband, and I'll just start talking, and he'll give me a confused look, or he won't give me a confused look, but it just kind of helps me sort through what I'm doing. And nowadays with technology, sometimes when I do that, I'll just hit the record button on my phone. And so I'll listen to myself just talk it through, and then I can transcribe. Sometimes it's just getting over that first kind of, just that first hurdle. And also I think, I know with my students, and Mark, I don't know if you feel this way, I definitely do. I write for precision often. And you just, if you start thinking that every word is like your final word as you write it down, you will be so paralyzed usually. Even if you know your topic really well, it's just really hard. And so I sometimes find myself like reluctant to put those first words on there for fear that I'll be stuck with them forever. And of course, you're not stuck with them at all. So sometimes it's freeing just to say, okay, I'm going to blab for the first hour, and I'm just going to literally not use punctuation, grammar, or anything. And I'm just going to write down everything that comes readily to mind. And then in the world of computers, this means more to you and I, Mark, than it does to most of our students. But when we grew up not having computers, This was harder, and literally cutting and pasting was something that we did, right? But on computers, it's just so much easier. So if you can get past kind of the struggle a little bit of having everything have to be perfect in its first draft. I didn't talk about drafting, but drafting is critical. I think that would be like my primary advice, and that's certainly what I tell students. It's part of the process. That's why I emphasize that time piece, right? If you don't give yourself time to write, it makes it just harder. I mean, you have to give yourself time to think and to kind of work through those obstacles.
Yeah, there's the New York Times sports writer, Red Smith, who won a bunch of prizes. I remember he said something, he has a quote along the lines of, writing is very easy. You just go to the typewriter and open up a vein. Describing how torturous it is. So.
And the visceral pain that we feel just, as an image, but also the idea of cutting open your vein is pretty like on par right there. Yep, it is.
Thanks.
It is. All right, anything else? Okay. That's what I've got. I will post my slides, or I will have somebody post them for us.
All right.
Looking to see who the...
We can share that in the Slack, and we'll share this recording.
Oh, good.
On YouTube.
Good. Excellent.
Right here. Thank you so much, Jen, for this amazing and incredibly useful
My pleasure.
session. I know for me and others, even if we're the ones not writing papers, it can affect us in our own like personal or creative writing as well. So thank you. So helpful.
Absolutely. A pleasure.
For all the students online, I want to promote our next few speaker sessions. It's going to be really exciting. So next week, we're going to have Representative Karen Bass, chair of the Congressional Black Caucus, former California Assembly Speaker. She's going to be speaking to us, and it's going to be really exciting. Following that, we'll have Ken Goldstein, head of ABC News' election night decision team. And so you'll hear all about what's going to be going down on election night and how they make the decisions of when to do when to call the states. And then following that, it's a really great opportunity to hear former Secretary of State Madeleine Albright talking about public policy, international relations, and her role when she was Secretary of State. So we have a really exciting month up ahead that we can't wait to share with all of you. Stay tuned for emails and social posts and updates, and check the Slack. So have a great rest of your Wednesday, and see you soon.